Dawn broke over the rugged mountains of the northwest frontier on September 12, 1897, illuminating a sight that would have broken the resolve of most men. Nearly 10,000 Afghan tribesmen, their weapons glinting in the morning light, surrounding a tiny outpost manned by just 21 Sikh soldiers. What followed wasn't merely a battle, but an act of defiance so profound that Queen Victoria herself would bow her head in respect. Yet history nearly forgot them. These 21 men of the 36th Sikh Regiment, led by the indomitable Havildar Ishar Singh, were about to transform a humble signalling relay into hallowed ground, choosing certain death over surrender in a stand that would redefine the very limits of human courage. The Khyber Pass carved a treacherous path through mountains that seemed to have been thrust upward by angry gods. For centuries, this narrow corridor had served as the invasion route for conquerors, from Alexander the Great to Genghis Khan, each leaving behind not just footprints, but blood. By the late 19th century, this rugged landscape had become the chessboard for what Rudyard Kipling famously called the Great Game. A shadowy conflict of espionage and territorial maneuvering between the British Empire and Tsarist Russia, with Afghanistan caught in between. The British strategy was elegantly simple, yet devilishly difficult to execute. Establish a network of fortified outposts to monitor and control movement through the frontier's mountain passes. Fort Lockhart and Fort Gulistan stood as the crown jewels of this defensive network, positioned on opposite hills with a commanding view of the Samana Range. But a problem emerged. These forts couldn't communicate directly with each other due to a blind spot created by the intervening ridge. The solution was Saragari, a modest signaling station established in 1891 on that very ridge, serving as the vital communication link between the larger forts. The 36th Sikhs, a regiment formed just 6 years earlier in 1887, had been handpicked for this dangerous assignment. Colonel John Horton, the commanding officer who had raised the regiment, selected his men with exacting standards. Recruiting primarily from the Jat Sikh community of Punjab, warriors known for their physical prowess and unwavering discipline. The regiment's distinctive dark blue turbans and imposing physical presence became a familiar sight along the frontier, earning them respect even among their tribal adversaries. By the summer of 1897, the political atmosphere had grown as hot as the scorching frontier sun. The Pashtun tribes, fiercely independent and increasingly unified under religious leaders preaching against foreign occupation, had begun rising up across the frontier. The Afridis and Orakzais, two of the most formidable tribal confederations, had joined forces, an alliance that sent shivers through the colonial administration. British intelligence reported increasing numbers of modern weapons flowing into tribal hands, many ironically manufactured in British factories before finding their way through Persian and Afghan markets to end up pointed at British soldiers. At Saragari, the warning signs were impossible to ignore. Tribesmen had been observed conducting reconnaissance of the outpost's defenses. Supply lines had been harassed with increasing boldness. The 21 men stationed there had strengthened their position as best they could, reinforcing the stone walls, stockpiling ammunition and water, and maintaining constant vigilance from their observation posts. They knew their position was precarious, a small force tasked with holding what was becoming one of the most strategically vital and vulnerable points on the entire frontier. As August turned to September, the men of Saragari continued their daily routines, maintaining the heliograph equipment for signaling, patrolling the perimeter, keeping their weapons in immaculate condition. None could have known that in just days, their modest outpost would become the focal point of one of history's most extraordinary last stands, and their names would be etched into the annals of military valor for all time. Havildar Ishar Singh stood at the edge of Saragari's stone parapet, his calloused hands resting on the rough surface as he surveyed the territory before him. At 41, the lines on his face told stories that his disciplined tongue rarely would. Campaigns against the Burmese, skirmishes along the Afghan border, and countless nights of vigilance in outposts just like this one. His thick black beard, carefully wrapped in accordance with Sikh tradition, framed a face that commanded respect without having to demand it. Among the 36th Sikhs, Ishar Singh's reputation preceded him. A soldier who had risen through ranks not through political connections, but through demonstrated courage and tactical acumen that even British officers grudgingly admired. Unlike many of his British superiors, Ishar understood the Pashtun mindset intimately. He respected their fighting prowess and their code of honor, Pashtunwali, which could transform yesterday's enemy into today's ally, or vice versa, based on complex tribal considerations that colonial administrators struggled to grasp. In another life, perhaps he and the tribal leaders now plotting against Saragari might have shared stories over a fire. But duty had placed them on opposite sides of an imperial boundary drawn by men who had never set foot on this harsh frontier. Behind him in the courtyard, Sepoy Gurmukh Singh was maintaining the heliograph, the solar telegraph device that was Saragari's reason for existence. Just 21 years old, and the youngest of the detachment, Gurmukh possessed an intuitive understanding of the device's mechanics that surpassed even his British instructors. His slender fingers calibrated the mirrors with precision, ensuring that, when needed, messages could be flashed to Fort Lockhart 7 miles to the northeast. The son of a farmer from Amritsar, Gurmukh had joined the regiment not just for the steady pay, but with dreams of adventure that now, as tribal tensions mounted, seemed less romantic than he had imagined. Naik Lal Singh, at 35, served as Ishar's right hand. The two men had developed a communication that required few words. A raised eyebrow from Ishar could prompt Lal to reorganize the duty roster, while a subtle nod from Lal could convey critical information about supplies or men's morale. His specialty was marksmanship, having won regimental shooting competitions 3 years running. The rifle that does not become an extension of your arm, he often told new recruits, will be the death of you when the fighting starts. Sepoy Bhagwan Singh carried both his massive frame and his 32 years with equal ease. His strength had become legendary within the regiment after an incident where he had single-handedly lifted a cartwheel out of mud when 2 other men had failed. Yet this physical power was balanced by a gentle soul. He was often found writing thoughtful letters to his wife and 3 children in Punjab, describing the mountains in poetic terms that belied his limited formal education. The cook for the detachment, Sepoy Jiwan Singh, had transformed the outpost's humble rations into meals that maintained both body and spirit. His secret spice mixture, carried all the way from his home village near Ludhiana, made even the most monotonous military provisions palatable. At 37, he had initially been viewed as too old for frontier service, but his uncanny ability to improve morale through food had made him indispensable. Each man at Saragari carried similar stories: sons, brothers, husbands who had taken the oath to serve in one of the British Empire's most elite regiments. They came from villages across Punjab, bringing regional dialects and personal quirks that had been forged into a cohesive brotherhood through shared hardship and discipline. Their turbans and beards marked them as followers of the Sikh faith, with its warrior tradition of the Khalsa established by Guru Gobind Singh 2 centuries earlier. What bound these 21 men was far more than military discipline or colonial salary. It was the concept of izzat, honor, that transcended both religious obligation and imperial loyalty. A Sikh soldier's honor was his most precious possession, worth more than life itself. This concept would soon be tested against impossible odds in a way that would transform these ordinary men into legends. As evening fell on September 11, 1897, The men of Saragari performed their daily rituals. Prayers were said, weapons cleaned, and watch rotations assigned. Some wrote letters home, perhaps sensing the gathering storm. Others sharpened their kirpans, the ceremonial daggers carried by all Sikhs, with methodical precision. None could have known that within hours they would be called upon to make a decision that would echo through military history for generations to come. The summer of 1897 had seen the frontier erupt like never before. What British colonial administrators dismissively termed tribal unrest was in reality a sophisticated, coordinated uprising that had been months in the making. A charismatic religious leader known as the Mad Fakir of Swat, a title that severely underestimated his tactical genius, had been moving from village to village, valley to valley, igniting the powder keg of tribal resentment against British encroachment. His message was simple yet potent. The foreign infidels must be driven from Muslim lands, and Allah would favor those who took up arms in this holy cause. By August, his words had borne fruit. The Mohmans had risen first, attacking British positions near Peshawar. Then came the Afridis, striking at the Khyber Pass itself, a shock to colonial administrators who had considered this tribe among their most reliable allies. Most alarming to the authorities in Simla was the unprecedented unity among traditionally fractious tribes. Ancient blood feuds had been temporarily set aside in service of the greater goal of expelling the foreigners. British intelligence estimated that over 25,000 tribal fighters were now under arms across the frontier, a staggering force compared to the thinly stretched colonial garrisons. Colonel John Horton had been monitoring these developments with growing concern from his headquarters. Reports crossed his desk daily of outposts harassed, supply lines cut, and loyal tribal informants assassinated. The 36th Sikhs were being stretched to their limit, with detachments scattered across vulnerable positions. When news arrived of the fall of two minor outposts to the northwest, Horton faced an agonizing decision about the Samana forts. Military logic suggested consolidating forces at the more defensible positions of Fort Lockhart and Fort Gulistan, abandoning the exposed signaling post at Saragari. But doing so would sever communications between the two major forts and potentially leave both vulnerable to being defeated in detail. After a sleepless night poring over maps by lamplight, Horton made his decision. Saragari would be maintained with a minimal garrison, just enough men to operate the heliograph and provide basic defense. It was a military calculation that weighed strategic necessity against human lives, the kind that commanders have made throughout history while knowing that others would pay the price of their judgment. On September 3rd, a dust-covered scout from the loyal Afridi faction arrived at Saragari with intelligence that sent a chill through the outpost. Mullah Syed Akbar, a lieutenant of the Mad Fakir, had united the Orakzai tribes and was personally leading a force toward the Samana range. British officers might have dismissed this as typical frontier exaggeration, but Havildar Ishar Singh knew better. The description of the mullah's black turban and his distinctive one-eyed appearance confirmed this was no rumor. Ishar had encountered the man's followers years earlier during a skirmish near the Kohat Pass and had witnessed firsthand their fanatical bravery. The following days brought an eerie quiet to the frontier, the silence before a typhoon. Patrols reported abandoned villages, with civilians fleeing to the mountains. Cattle and goats had vanished from grazing lands. At night, the usual distant fires of shepherd camps were conspicuously absent from the hillsides. Nature itself seemed to sense the approaching conflict. The normally ubiquitous frontier birds had grown scarce, as if having decided to seek safer territories. On September 8th, Fort Gulistan detected the first substantial tribal movement, a force of approximately 3,000 warriors moving through a distant valley. Heliograph messages flashed between the three positions as British and Sikh officers assessed the threat. The initial consensus was that Fort Gulistan would be the primary target, given its position controlling access to several valuable valleys. This assessment changed dramatically on September 9th, when Sepoy Bhagwan Singh, using the outpost's only telescope during his morning watch, spotted unmistakable signs of tribal scouts on the ridges surrounding Saragari. Through breaks in the morning mist, he counted at least 15 men moving with the practiced stealth of lifelong mountaineers, studying the outpost's defenses. When he reported this to Ishar Singh, the Havildar's expression remained impassive, but he immediately ordered defensive preparations accelerated. The stone walls of Saragari, while solid, had not been designed to withstand a major assault. The men worked tirelessly to shore up vulnerabilities, reinforcing the wooden main gate with additional bracing, establishing clear fields of fire, and carefully counting and distributing their limited ammunition. Each man was allotted 400 rounds for his Martini-Henry rifle, a substantial amount under normal circumstances, but potentially insufficient against the horde they all sensed was coming. Water would be critical. The outpost's well, while deep, could be compromised if attackers gained even partial control of the position. Every available container was filled and stored in protected locations throughout the small compound. Food supplies were similarly assessed and positioned for accessibility during combat. The soldiers worked with quiet efficiency. The gravity of their situation reflected not in panic, but in the meticulous attention they paid to these life-or-death details. On the night of September 11th, an unusual stillness enveloped the frontier. Even the persistent mountain wind seemed to have paused its eternal journey. In the cramped barracks room of Saragari, some men slept the deep sleep of soldiers who had learned to rest whenever possible before battle. Others wrote final letters by lamplight, their pencils moving across paper with deliberate strokes, knowing these might be their last words to loved ones. Sepoy Jivan Singh distributed an extra ration of jaggery, raw sugar, a small luxury that acknowledged the unspoken understanding among the men. At the parapet, Havildar Ishar Singh stood his personal watch, despite having assigned himself no formal duty that night. His eyes scanned the moonlit landscape with the intensity of a man committing a sight to memory. In the distance, he could make out the faintest pinpricks of light, campfires carefully shielded but betraying the presence of what his experienced eye told him was a force of unprecedented size. The tribal army had arrived, and with the dawn would come a test of everything these 21 Sikhs embodied. Saragari was never meant to be a fortress. Unlike the imposing Fort Lockhart with its multiple bastions or Fort Gulistan's commanding position, Saragari had been conceived as little more than a signaling relay, a humble link in the communication chain. Its transformation into a defensive position came through necessity rather than design, and understanding its layout is crucial to appreciating the drama that would unfold within its walls. The outpost stood on a rocky ridge at 6,000 feet elevation, its foundations anchored to the unforgiving mountain stone. Its roughly rectangular perimeter measured approximately 50 by 30 yards, barely the size of a modern tennis court. The outer walls, constructed of local stone mortared with mud and lime, rose to a height of 12 feet, providing the basic barrier against attack. These walls, while substantial, lacked the sophisticated defensive features of purpose-built fortifications. There were no angled bastions to provide covering fire, no moat to impede approach, no reinforced positions for artillery. The main gate faced northeast toward Fort Lockhart and represented the most vulnerable point in the defenses. Constructed of thick wooden planks bound with iron strapping, it was designed more to keep out the harsh winter elements than to repel determined attackers. Inside this gate lay a small courtyard where the daily business of the outpost was conducted: cooking, equipment maintenance, and the mundane tasks that defined military life on the frontier. Against the western wall stood the barracks, a single-story structure with a flat roof that served as an observation platform. Inside, the Spartanly furnished room contained the men's bedrolls, personal effects, and the small religious shrine where the regiment's copy of the Guru Granth Sahib was kept. Adjacent to the barracks was the modest ammunition store, its contents meticulously organized according to military regulations. Boxes of .45 caliber cartridges for the Martini-Henry rifles, cleaning kits, and spare parts. The heart of Saragari, its reason for existence, was the signaling tower. Rising an additional 15 feet above the northwestern corner of the compound, this square structure housed the heliograph equipment. The tower offered an unobstructed line of sight to both Fort Lockhart and Fort Gulistan, allowing messages to be relayed between the two larger fortifications. With skilled operators like Sepoy Gurmukh Singh manning the equipment, complex messages could be transmitted at a rate of about 4 words per minute, slow by modern standards but revolutionary in 1897. Water came from a well sunk deep into the ridge, supplemented by a cistern that collected rainfall. Food supplies were basic but adequate: flour for chapatis, lentils, tea, sugar, and occasionally meat when local hunting proved successful or supplies came from the larger forts. The outpost design prioritized function over comfort, reflecting the British Army's utilitarian approach to frontier postings. In the days before September 12th, Havildar Ishar Singh had directed a series of modifications to enhance Saragari's defensive capabilities. Under his guidance, the men had created firing platforms behind the walls, carefully positioned to maximize coverage of the approaches. Loose rocks had been gathered and placed at intervals along the parapet, improvised missiles that could be dropped on attackers who reached the base of the walls. The main gate had been reinforced with additional bracing, though all recognized this would remain the most vulnerable point. Most critically, Ishar had established a fallback position within the outpost itself. If the outer walls were breached, the signaling tower would serve as a last redoubt. Its narrow staircase could be defended by a single determined man, while those above could maintain fire on attackers in the courtyard. This plan reflected Ishar's pragmatic understanding of their situation. They must be prepared to fight for every inch, to make the enemy pay dearly for each advance. The outpost's communication system was both its purpose and its lifeline. The heliograph, a device that used adjustable mirrors to flash sunlight in coded patterns, could transmit messages over extraordinary distances when weather permitted. At night or in poor visibility, signaling lamps served as backup. The 36th Sikhs had developed their own modified version of Morse code, incorporating Punjabi phrases to convey complex tactical information with minimal transmission time. This system allowed the 3 positions of the Samana Range to function as a single integrated defensive network, despite their physical separation. As dawn approached on September 12th, each man knew his assigned position and responsibilities with absolute clarity. The northwest section of the wall, commanding the approach from the Afghan border, was assigned to Sepoys Lal Singh and Jiwan Singh, both crack shots with their Martini-Henrys. The eastern wall, overlooking the steep drop toward British-controlled territory, was the responsibility of Sepoys Bhagwan Singh and Narayan Singh. The critically vulnerable main gate would be defended by a rotating team of 4 men under the direct supervision of Naik Lal Singh. Sepoy Gurmukh Singh, as the primary signaller, would remain in the tower, maintaining communication with Fort Lockhart until or unless the situation required every rifle for defense. The remaining men would serve as a mobile reserve, reinforcing threatened sections of the perimeter as needed under Ishar Singh's direction. Ammunition had been distributed to positions throughout the outpost, ensuring that defenders would not need to abandon their posts to resupply. The Martini-Henry rifles that would become the primary instruments of the upcoming battle deserve special mention. These single-shot, lever-action weapons fired a massive .45 caliber bullet, capable of penetrating multiple adversaries. Their effective range exceeded 600 yards in skilled hands, and the distinctive deep boom of their discharge had earned them the nickname, the Voice of the Empire, among frontier tribes. Each of the Sikhs had trained extensively with these weapons, developing the ability to maintain accurate rapid fire despite the rifle's substantial recoil. As first light touched the eastern horizon on September 12th, the 21 defenders of Saragari stood ready at their positions. Their modest fortification, never designed for the trial it was about to face, would in the coming hours be transformed from an unremarkable relay station into hallowed ground. Through the planning and preparation was complete, yet one crucial element remained undefined: the enemy force gathering in the pre-dawn shadows. As visibility improved, the true scale of that force would become apparent, and with it, the full magnitude of the challenge facing Saragari's defenders. The morning mist clung to the valleys below Saragari like a shroud, concealing whatever moved beneath its undulating surface. As the September sun climbed higher, the thermal currents began to stir this vaporous blanket, creating momentary windows of visibility through which Sepoy Bhagwan Singh caught his first glimpse of the reality they faced. What he saw through the telescope caused even his veteran hands to tremble slightly as he adjusted the focus. "Havildar ji," he called with measured calm that belied the gravity of his discovery. "You should see this." Ishar Singh took the telescope, his face betraying no emotion as he systematically scanned the clearing mist. Where yesterday there had been empty ravines and barren slopes, now the landscape teemed with movement. The tribal army had materialized overnight as if conjured from the earth itself. They filled the northern approaches in dark waves, their distinctive indigo and black clothing creating a shifting mosaic against the tawny landscape. "How many?" asked Naik Lal Singh, squinting toward the mass of humanity that was becoming increasingly visible as the mist retreated. 8,000 at minimum, Ishar replied with clinical detachment. "Possibly 10. He continued his methodical survey, noting the tribal banners that identified major clan groupings. Afridi, Orakzai, Mahsud, and others I don't recognize. This is not a raiding party, this is their main force." The men absorbed this information in silence. British military doctrine held that properly entrenched troops could hold against odds of 10 to 1. They were facing odds approaching 500 to 1. At precisely 9 a.m., Sepoy Gurmukh Singh's heliograph flashed to life, sending the first official report to Fort Lockhart. "Enemy approaching Saragari. Stop estimated strength, 1,000. Stop awaiting orders. Stop." The 7 miles separating the outpost from its command seemed suddenly vast. The response, when it came 3 minutes later, was terse. "Hold position. Stop reinforcements. Impossible immediately. Stop brigade notified. Stop." Colonel Horton, commanding at Fort Lockhart, faced an impossible equation. His available mobile force consisted of barely 100 men, insufficient to break through to Saragari without leaving Lockhart itself vulnerable to assault. As this exchange took place, the tribal force began deploying with a tactical sophistication that shattered colonial stereotypes of undisciplined tribesmen. Under the direction of their war leaders, they split into 3 distinct groups. The largest contingent, comprising approximately 6,000 fighters, took positions directly north of Saragari, occupying the gradual slope that provided the easiest approach to the outpost. A second force of roughly 2,000 moved to the west, positioning themselves to cut off any potential retreat toward Afghan territory. The third group, numbering perhaps 1,500, circled to occupy the high ground southeast of the outpost. a position from which they could observe Fort Lockhart and potentially intercept any relief force. At 9:30 a.m., a single rider separated from the main tribal mass and advanced towards Saragari, a white flag clearly visible. This adherence to formalities surprised the defenders. The tribal emissary halted at 300 yards, just beyond effective rifle range, and waited. "They want to parley," Ishar observed. "I will meet him halfway." "It could be a trap, Havildarji," cautioned Niklal Singh. "If they wanted to simply kill us, they would not need subterfuge," Ishar replied with grim logic. "They outnumber our bullets." After notifying Fort Lockhart of this development, Ishar Singh descended from the parapet and exited through the main gate, his Martini-Henry slung across his back as a gesture of truce compliance, while his kirpan remained visibly at his side. He walked with measured steps across the open ground, conscious that 20,000 eyes were upon him, until he reached a point approximately 150 yards from the outpost. The tribal emissary approached with similar deliberation. He was a man of striking appearance, tall even by Pashtun standards, with a black beard streaked with grey and the distinctive indigo turban of a senior Orakzai clan leader. The two men sized each other up with the mutual respect of dedicated warriors before exchanging formal greetings in Pashto, the lingua franca of the frontier. "I am Gul Badshah, sword of the Orakzai and servant of the faith," the emissary introduced himself. "I bring words from Mullah Syed Akbar." "Havildar Ishar Singh, 36th Sikhs," came the simple reply. "The mullah recognizes the bravery of Sikhs and has no personal quarrel with your men," Gul Badshah continued. "He offers you safe passage. Lay down your weapons, leave the fortress, and you may proceed to Fort Lockhart unharmed. This I swear upon my honor and by the name of Allah." The offer was not without precedent. Tribal warfare operated under complex codes of honor, and such gestures had occasionally been honored in previous conflicts. Yet Ishar Singh understood the deeper strategic calculus at work. If Saragari fell without resistance, the communication link between the major forts would be severed, potentially allowing the tribal force to defeat each garrison in isolation. "And if we decline?" Ishar asked, already knowing the answer. "Then none will leave alive," Gul Badshah stated without malice, simply acknowledging the inevitable mathematics of the situation. Why die for the foreigners who use you as shields? They will write your names in some book, perhaps give medals to your widows, then replace you with other fools. The British use your people's courage to compensate for their own shortage of men. This psychological warfare was cleverly targeted. Relations between Sikh regiments and their British officers were complex. Respect existed alongside undeniable racial hierarchies. Yet Ishar's response came without hesitation. "I must consult with my men. We will signal our answer within the hour." The two warriors saluted each other with genuine respect before turning back toward their respective positions. As Ishar walked back to Saragari, he felt an odd sense of calm. The decision ahead was momentous, yet in another sense, already made. Inside the outpost, he gathered the 20 men and relayed the terms offered. Military protocol would have permitted Ishar to make this decision unilaterally, but Sikh tradition demanded consultation on matters affecting the collective honor. "They offer safe passage if we abandon our post," he concluded. "I have told them we will consider their terms." A brief silence followed as each man confronted the full weight of their situation. It was Sepoy Gurmukh Singh, the youngest present, who spoke first. "Havildarji, what does Fort Lockhart command?" "They order us to hold position," Ishar answered. "But I will tell you plainly, we cannot hold against such numbers forever, and relief cannot reach us quickly. If we choose to stand, We choose to die. Another silence fell, heavier than the first. Then, Ishar Singh removed his turban and placed it at Ishar's feet, a profound gesture of commitment in Sikh tradition. "My life was sworn to this regiment and our faith," he said simply. "I will not break that oath today." One by one, each man removed his turban and added it to the pile, a unanimous decision made without further words. Ishar Singh looked at the 20 turbans before him, understanding fully the weight of responsibility this placed upon his leadership. These men had just voted to sacrifice their lives rather than compromise their honor or duty. At precisely 10 a.m., Sepoy Gurmukh Singh's heliograph signaled Fort Lockhart. "Enemy offered safe passage in exchange for abandoning post stop all ranks. Choose to stand. Stop request permission to engage enemy stop." The response from Colonel Horton came with uncharacteristic emotion. "Permission granted. Stop proud to command such men. Stop fight well. 36th stop." From the parapet, Ishar Singh raised his rifle overhead in clear view of the waiting tribal army. The universally understood rejection of terms. A momentary hush fell over the landscape, as if the mountains themselves held their breath at the audacity of 21 men defying an army. The silence was shattered at 10:15 a.m. when the first volley of tribal gunfire struck Saragari's walls. The battle that would secure these 21 men's place in military history had begun. The first tribal volley was more psychological than tactical, a thunderous demonstration of firepower from hundreds of Jezayil long rifles and newly acquired Martini-Henrys, many ironically captured from previous British defeats. Bullets struck Saragari's walls with the sound of hail on a tin roof, chipping stone and sending dust spiraling into the air. The Sikhs held their positions with iron discipline, no man flinching despite the barrage. "Hold fire!" Ishar Singh commanded, his voice cutting through the din. "Wait for proper targets. Every bullet must find its mark." This was not bravado, but mathematical necessity. With limited ammunition and overwhelming opposition, indiscriminate fire would only hasten their inevitable defeat. The tribal force, perhaps mistaking the defenders' restraint for suppression, launched their first probing attack at 10:30 a.m., approximately 200 warriors charging directly toward the north wall behind a covering barrage. "North wall, prepare," Ishar called calmly. The defenders adjusted their positions, rifles resting steadily on the stonework. Wait," he continued, judging distance with an expert eye. When the charging mass reached 400 yards, optimal range for their Martini-Henrys, his command rang out, "Fire!" 5 rifles discharged in near-perfect unison. 5 tribal warriors fell. The Sikhs worked their lever actions with practiced efficiency, ejecting spent cartridges and chambering fresh rounds. 5 more shots, 5 more fallen attackers. The rhythmic cycle of load and fire continued with mechanical precision, creating a continuous stream of devastating fire that seemed impossible from so few weapons. The tribal charge faltered at 300 yards, breaking apart as warriors sought cover behind rocks and depressions in the terrain. Even in retreat, they demonstrated tactical sophistication, withdrawing in stages with covering fire rather than fleeing outright. As the last attackers disappeared from effective range, an expectant hush fell over the defenders' position. 8 rounds each expended, reported Ishar Singh, who had maintained a count through the engagement. 17 confirmed hits. Despite the skewed mathematics of their situation, the first exchange had gone decisively in favor of the defenders. The heliograph clattered to life, relaying this initial success to Fort Lockhart. First attack. Repulsed, stop minimal ammunition, expended, stop all defenders, unharmed, stop. Colonel Horton's response revealed the broader strategic picture. Large enemy force. Also observed vicinity. Fort Gulistan. Stop hold position. Stop crucial to maintain communications. Stop. This message crystallized the full strategic importance of their stand. The tribal forces had launched a coordinated offensive against multiple points in the British defensive network. Saragari, initially the weakest point, now served as the critical information conduit between otherwise isolated garrisons. Every minute the 21 held their position was another minute the larger forts could prepare, another minute for distant relief columns to march closer. The tribal army, regrouping after their initial repulse, now demonstrated why they had become such formidable opponents of the British Empire. Rather than launching another frontal assault, they began methodically establishing firing positions at the extreme range of their weapons, approximately 800 yards from Saragari's walls. From these positions, hundreds of tribal marksmen initiated a continuous harassing fire, while others worked their way around the outpost's flanks, seeking blind spots in the defenders' fields of fire. At 11:45 a.m., the tribal force unveiled another tactical innovation that displayed their adaptability. Fighters advanced carrying large shields fashioned from thick wooden doors and metal plates, improvised but effective protection against rifle fire. Behind each shield, 3 to 4 warriors moved forward in short rushes, presenting minimal targets while closing the distance to the walls. "Aim for the legs beneath the shields," Ishar directed. The defenders adjusted their fire accordingly, but their hit rate dropped significantly against these reduced targets. The shield-bearers continued their advance, some falling, but others reaching the relative safety of the dead ground, directly beneath Saragari's walls, positions from which the defenders could not target them without exposing themselves to the covering fire from the tribal marksmen. By noon, an estimated 40 to 50 tribal fighters had established positions in this dead ground, primarily along the north and west walls. The tactical problem they presented was substantial. They could not be engaged directly, yet if left unmolested, they would eventually undermine the wall foundations or attempt to scale the defenses. It was Sepoy Bhagwan Singh who proposed the solution. "The stone piles, Havildar, he suggested, pointing to the collections of loose rocks they had gathered earlier as improvised missiles. "We can drop them over the edge without exposing ourselves." Ishar nodded approval. The defenders carefully pushed the heavy stones over the parapets, eliciting cries of pain and anger from below as the improvised artillery found human targets. This primitive but effective tactic forced many of the tribesmen to abandon their sheltered positions, exposing themselves to conventional fire as they retreated. At 12:30 p.m., Sepoy Gurmukh Singh reported a new development via heliograph. "Observed enemy carrying materials toward north approach stop appears to be constructing something stop." The tribal force had begun assembling improvised ladders and ramps from materials apparently prepared in advance, a clear indication that the attack on Saragari had been carefully planned rather than opportunistic. This preparation indicated a sophisticated understanding of the outpost's vulnerabilities and suggested the presence of either deserters from colonial forces or informants who had provided detailed intelligence. Colonel Horton's response to this development was direct. "Destroy ladders at all costs. Stop priority. Target stop." As the defenders adjusted their fire to target the ladder construction parties, Ishar Singh called his men into brief rotation, ensuring each had water and a moment's rest. The September sun beat down mercilessly on the exposed stone outpost, adding dehydration to the defenders' concerns. The temperature inside the stone walls had climbed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and sweat-soaked uniforms clung to the men's bodies as they maintained their vigilance. At 1:15 p.m., the tribal force launched their most coordinated attack yet. Under cover of intensified rifle fire from their fixed positions, hundreds of fighters charged simultaneously from multiple directions, many carrying the newly constructed scaling ladders. This was no probing attack, but a determined attempt to overwhelm the defenses through sheer weight of numbers. "All positions, independent fire," Ishar ordered, recognizing that centralized control was now impossible amid the chaos. "Conserve ammunition, but stop those ladders." The defenders responded with disciplined fury, each man selecting targets based on the threat they posed rather than mere proximity. Those carrying ladders received priority attention, and dozens fell before reaching the walls. Yet the mathematics of the situation began to tell. For every attacker who fell, 10 more continued forward. Sepoy Kartar Singh, firing from the northwest corner, took a bullet through his left shoulder but continued working his rifle with grim determination. Sepoy Jeevan Singh suffered a grazing wound to his head that covered his face in blood, yet he refused to abandon his position. The defenders' marksmanship exacted a terrible toll on the attackers, but some ladders inevitably reached the walls. As the first scaling ladder thumped against the northern wall, Ishar Singh demonstrated why he commanded such respect among his men. Grabbing a fallen comrade's rifle in addition to his own, he moved to the threatened position. When the first tribal warrior appeared at the top of the ladder, Ishar fired his first rifle, sending the man tumbling backward. Dropping this empty weapon, he immediately brought the second rifle to bear on the next attacker with equal effect. By the time both rifles were empty, 4 attackers lay dead at the base of their ladder. Similar scenes played out around the perimeter as ladders reached the walls at multiple points. The defenders, now fighting at extreme close quarters, transitioned to bayonets when necessary, thrusting downward at climbers with lethal efficiency. Stones, equipment, even personal items were pressed into service as improvised weapons to repel the assault. By 2:00 p.m., the tide of the attack had receded, leaving scores of dead and wounded tribesmen scattered around Saragari's blood-spattered walls. Inside the outpost, the defenders had suffered as well. 2 men killed outright and 6 others wounded to varying degrees. Ammunition was becoming a critical concern, with some defenders down to fewer than 100 rounds each. As the fighting temporarily subsided, Sepoy Gurmukh Singh sent what would become one of the most famous heliograph messages in military history. "Need ammunition. Stop 2 killed. Stop attack. Repulsed for now. Stop what are orders. Stop." The reply from Fort Lockhart laid bare the strategic reality. "Cannot send ammunition or reinforcements. Stop brigade. Still 8 hours. March distant. Stop maintain position. As long as possible. Stop." With this message, the nature of their mission clarified with brutal finality. There would be no relief, no reinforcement, no resupply. Their duty was to buy time with their lives. Time for the larger garrisons to prepare. Time for relief forces to arrive. Time for the critical communication link to remain intact. Ishar Singh gathered his remaining able-bodied men, while Sepoy Gurmukh Singh continued his vital communication role in the signal tower. The Havildar's normally impassive face showed the first traces of fatigue, yet his voice remained steady as he outlined their situation without embellishment. "We have ammunition for perhaps one more major attack," he concluded. "After that, we fight with bayonets and kirpans until the end." The men received this assessment in silence, already having made their peace with the inevitable outcome. Then Sepoy Bhagwan Singh spoke, his deep voice resonating with conviction rather than despair. "Then we shall give them such an end as will be remembered as long as there are Sikhs to tell the tale." A murmur of agreement passed through the gathered men. Ishar nodded once, acknowledging the sentiment, then issued his final tactical orders, concentrating their remaining strength at the most vulnerable points, establishing fallback positions within the outpost, and ensuring the signaling tower remained operational until the last possible moment. As the defenders returned to their positions, the tribal drums began beating again, signaling the preparation for what would surely be the final assault. The 21 Sikhs of Saragari, having made their impossible choice, now prepared to face its ultimate consequences. While the defenders of Saragari reinforced their positions and tended to their wounded, the tribal army underwent a transformation. What had begun as a loosely coordinated mass of fighters was now reorganizing under the direct leadership of Mullah Syed Akbar, who had arrived on the battlefield shortly after the failed scaling ladder assault. His presence electrified the tribal force, converting the tactical setback into renewed religious fervor. Standing atop a prominent boulder visible from Saragari, the mullah cut an imposing figure in his flowing black robes and distinctive eye patch, the result of a British bullet years earlier that had only hardened his resolve against the foreigners. Through field glasses, Ishar Singh observed the mullah moving among his fighters, touching foreheads with clan leaders and gesturing emphatically toward the outpost. Even without hearing the words, the Havildar understood their import. This was no longer merely a military operation, but a holy cause. "They will come again before sunset," Ishar predicted, lowering his field glasses. "And they will not retreat a second time." The tribal reorganization revealed sophisticated military understanding that colonial administrators had consistently underestimated. Fighters were systematically divided into functional groups. Designated marksmen took positions on elevated terrain to provide covering fire. Assault teams gathered behind natural barriers, preparing for the charge, and specialized units assembled equipment for breaching the outpost defenses. Most concerning was the activity visible approximately half a mile north of Saragari, where hundreds of tribesmen were constructing large wooden frameworks. The purpose of these structures became apparent as they were draped with layers of wet animal hides, mobile shields large enough to protect groups of fighters as they approached the walls, designed specifically to counter the defenders' rifle fire. Fort Lockhart, observing this development through telescopes, sent an urgent heliograph message. "Enemy building. Mantlets stop preparing. Major assault. Stop estimate your ammunition. Remaining query." Sepoy Gurmukh Singh's reply was terse. "Approximately 400 rounds remaining. Stop insufficient for extended defense stop." The tribal army's composition itself told a story of the frontier's complex politics. The bulk of the force consisted of Orakzai tribesmen, traditional hill fighters known for their marksmanship and stamina. Intermingled were contingents of Afridi warriors, distinctive in their indigo turbans and carrying curved talwars alongside modern rifles. Smaller groups of Masuds and Wazirs completed the coalition. These normally antagonistic tribes unified temporarily under the mullah's charismatic leadership. Their weapons reflected the frontier's position as crossroads of empires. Many carried traditional jaziles, long-barreled, locally manufactured rifles, deadly in the hands of experienced mountaineers. Others wielded captured British Martini-Henrys or Snyders, while the wealthiest and most prestigious fighters displayed Russian-made rifles, procured through the shadowy arms markets of Central Asia. Nearly every man carried multiple-edged weapons, combinations of tulwars, kharas, Afghan knives, and the distinctive Khyber knives with their single-edged T-spine blades. At 3:30 p.m., a new development caught the defenders' attention. Tribal fighters began herding livestock, primarily goats, toward the northern approach of Saragari. This primitive but effective tactic had been employed in frontier warfare for centuries. The animals would absorb the initial defensive fire and create confusion, while the main assault force followed closely behind. Inside Saragari, the defenders made their final preparations. Ammunition was redistributed, ensuring each man had at least some capability to resist. The wounded who could still handle rifles were positioned to cover the courtyard from the barracks windows, creating fields of fire that would engage any enemies who breached the outer walls. Sepoy Jivan Singh, despite his head wound, insisted on returning to his post after receiving basic treatment. A strip of cloth tightly bound around his temples, still dark with blood. "Save the last bullet for yourself," Nik Lal Singh advised the younger soldiers matter-of-factly. "Better that than what happens if they take you alive." The men nodded grimly, understanding the frontier's harsh realities. Captives rarely survived, and those who did often wished they hadn't. At 4 p.m., the attack began with a deafening fusillade from hundreds of tribal marksmen, concentrated particularly on the outpost's parapets to suppress defensive fire. Simultaneously, the livestock were driven forward toward the northern wall, followed closely by the first wave of attackers sheltering behind the mobile mantlets. These massive shields, carried by teams of 6 men each, proved remarkably effective. The water-soaked hides absorbed bullets without shattering the wooden frames beneath. "Hold fire until they reach 200 yards, Ishar Singh commanded, recognizing the need to conserve their dwindling ammunition. "Target the feet beneath the mantlets." When the advancing force reached the designated range, the defenders opened fire with disciplined precision. Some bullets found their marks, dropping tribal fighters whose feet had momentarily become visible beneath the shields. Yet the overall effectiveness of the Sikhs' fire had been significantly reduced by this tactical innovation. Within minutes, the first mantlets reached the base of Saragari's northern wall. Under their protection, tribal fighters began the systematic dismantling of the wall's foundation stones, using tools clearly brought for this specific purpose: iron pry bars, mauls, and primitive picks. The defenders attempted to dislodge these sappers by dropping stones and firing at extreme angles, but the mantlets provided effective cover for the breaching operation. The western wall faced similar pressure, with 3 mantlets providing cover for breaching teams. Ishar Singh, recognizing the existential threat, personally led a desperate counterattack at this section. Ordering covering fire from adjacent positions, he and 2 volunteers charged along the parapet, hurling improvised incendiaries, cloth wrapped around oil-soaked wood, onto the mantlets below. One shield caught fire, forcing its abandoners to flee into defensive fire. The other 2 remained operational, their wet hides resistant to the flames. At 4:45 p.m., a section of the northern wall approximately 3 feet wide collapsed with a thunderous rumble, sending clouds of dust billowing into the courtyard. The breach had been achieved faster than even the most pessimistic defender had anticipated. Tribal fighters immediately attempted to pour through the opening, but found themselves channeled into a lethal funnel of concentrated fire from the interior defensive positions. The first wave of attackers died in the breach itself, their bodies creating a grisly barricade that temporarily sealed the gap they had created. The second wave climbed over their fallen comrades, some making it fully into the courtyard before being cut down by defensive fire from the barracks windows and the signaling tower. For 5 frantic minutes, the breach became a slaughterhouse, as attack after attack was repulsed with desperate efficiency. Recognizing the futility of frontal assault through such a narrow gap, the tribal leaders adjusted their tactics. The breaching teams redoubled their efforts, widening the collapse while additional mantlets were brought forward to protect them. Simultaneously, scaling ladders were again deployed against multiple sections of the walls, forcing the defenders to divide their already stretched resources. At 5:10 p.m., Sepoy Gurmukh Singh's heliograph sent what would be the final detailed situation report. North wall breached, stop enemy, inside compound, stop casualties, heavy, both sides, stop ammunition, critical, stop will maintain communication, as long as possible, stop. Colonel Horton's reply revealed the broader strategic picture that gave meaning to their sacrifice. Tribal forces withdrawing. From Fort Gulistan perimeter, stop your action. Drawing enemy strength, stop brigade. Approaching from south, Stop, hold. As long as possible. Stop. By 5:30 p.m., the situation had deteriorated dramatically. The northern breach had been widened to approximately 10 feet, allowing multiple tribal fighters to enter simultaneously. A second breach had been created in the western wall, while scaling ladders had successfully delivered attackers atop the eastern section. The courtyard had become a chaotic melee of individual combat, with the defenders now fighting in small, isolated groups rather than as a coordinated force. Ishar Singh, recognizing that the outer defenses were now untenable, ordered a fighting withdrawal to their final position, the signaling tower and adjacent barracks. This textbook military maneuver was executed with remarkable discipline, despite the chaos engulfing the outpost. The surviving defenders laid down covering fire while their comrades retreated in stages, each group protecting the next until they reached the relative safety of the tower's stone walls. By 5:45 p.m., the main courtyard had been abandoned to the tribal forces, who swarmed through the breaches and over the walls in overwhelming numbers. The surviving defenders, now reduced to fewer than 10 unwounded men, barricaded themselves in their final redoubt. The narrow staircase leading to the upper level of the signaling tower became their last defensible position, where a single determined man could hold back dozens. As tribal fighters attempted to force their way up this staircase, they confronted the raw essence of Sikh martial spirit. Naik Lal Singh, his ammunition exhausted, defended the stairs with bayonet and kirpan, personally accounting for 7 attackers before finally being overwhelmed. His sacrifice bought precious minutes for Sepoy Gurmukh Singh to send what would become one of the most famous final messages in military history. At 5:53 p.m., the heliograph flashed from Saragari to Fort Lockhart. Enemy overwhelming position. Stop last man, last round. Stop request permission. To dismount heliograph and join final defense. Stop. Colonel Horton's response was immediate. Permission granted, stop. Then, breaking military protocol with an unprecedented personal message. Act for regiment and God stop. With this final communication, Sepoy Gurmukh Singh carefully dismantled the precious heliograph equipment to prevent its capture, then shouldered his rifle to descend into what had become the final stand of the 36th Sikhs at Saragari. The 21 had fulfilled their mission, maintaining communications until the very last moments, and fixing in place a tribal force that might otherwise have overwhelmed the larger British garrisons. Their sacrifice would soon pass into legend, but in these final moments, they were simply soldiers refusing to yield, despite the mathematical certainty of defeat. The tribal victory at Saragari seemed inevitable from the moment the first wall was breached, yet the final phase of the battle defied all conventional military logic. What should have been a swift overrunning of the remaining defenders instead devolved into a series of bloody, close-quarter engagements that would later be studied in military academies across the world. After dismantling the heliograph, Sepoy Gurmukh Singh descended to join what remained of the Saragari garrison. He found a scene of organized chaos. Havildar Ishar Singh had established a final defensive perimeter within the barracks building, using overturned furniture, equipment chests, and the bodies of fallen comrades to create a makeshift barricade. Behind this grim fortification, the last 5 unwounded defenders and 3 walking wounded had established firing positions covering the building's single doorway and 2 windows. "Signaller reporting for duty, Havildar G," Gurmukh announced with parade ground formality that seemed surreally out of place amid the carnage. Ishar Singh merely nodded, handing the young Sikh a fallen comrade's bandolier with its precious remaining cartridges. "Take position by the east window," he ordered. "Fire only when you have a clear target." Outside, the tribal force had momentarily paused their advance, seemingly stunned by the ferocity of resistance they had encountered. Their casualties had far exceeded anything they had anticipated. Later British intelligence estimates suggested that, by this point, approximately 180 tribal fighters had been killed, and perhaps twice that number wounded. For a tribal leader, such losses carried not just military but social and political consequences, as each dead warrior represented a family that would demand blood price or revenge. This brief respite allowed the defenders a moment to prepare for what all knew would be their final stand. Ammunition was counted and redistributed. Fewer than 60 rounds remained in total, approximately 7 per man. Turbans were retied, prayers whispered, and in a final gesture of Sikh martial tradition, the men exchanged brief embraces, acknowledging the brotherhood that had brought them to this moment. At 6:02 p.m., the assault resumed with an approach that demonstrated the tribal forces' tactical adaptability. Rather than charging directly into defensive fire, they began systematically dismantling the barracks building from multiple angles. Some fighters pried at the stone walls with tools, while others gathered combustible materials, wood from damaged furniture, cloth, and the outpost's own limited oil supplies, to prepare fires. The defenders responded with precisely targeted shots, each carefully calculated to eliminate the most immediate threat. When a tribal fighter appeared at the doorway with a flaming torch, Sepoy Lal Singh dropped him with a single round. When another attempted to climb through the eastern window, Sepoy Gurmukh Singh's bayonet met him mid-entry, the force of the thrust pushing the man back among his fellows. Despite these individual successes, the mathematics of the situation remained unsolvable. By 6:15 p.m., multiple small fires had been started against the exterior walls and roof of the barracks. The stone construction resisted immediate combustion, but smoke began seeping through cracks, filling the interior with acrid fumes that burned the defenders' lungs and stung their eyes. Ishar Singh, recognizing that their position would soon become untenable, made a final tactical decision that exemplified the Sikh warrior ethos. Rather than passively awaiting death by fire or suffocation, he would lead his remaining men in one last offensive action, not with any hope of victory, but to die as their tradition demanded, weapons in hand, facing their enemy. "Fix bayonets," he ordered, his voice steady despite the thickening smoke. "We will advance through the main door on my command. Kill as many as you can before you fall." The 6 men, who could still stand, formed a wedge formation behind Ishar, bayonets gleaming in the smoke-filtered light. Those 2 wounded to join the charge offered to provide covering fire with the remaining ammunition, buying precious seconds for their comrades' final advance. At precisely 6:21 p.m., a time recorded in tribal accounts, later shared with British intelligence officers, Havildar Ishar Singh let out the Sikh war cry, "Bole so nihal, Sat Shri Akal." Whoever utters the phrase shall be fulfilled. Truth is eternal. The wounded defenders fired their weapons in a final volley, and Ishar burst through the doorway with his remaining men close behind. What followed has become legendary in military history, recorded in tribal accounts with a mixture of awe and reverence that transcended the battle's political context. Ishar Singh, his imposing frame silhouetted against the smoke billowing from the barracks, charged directly into the mass of tribal fighters that had gathered to burn out the defenders. His Martini-Henry, with fixed bayonet, claimed 3 lives in the first few seconds as the sheer audacity of the attack created momentary confusion among the attackers. When the rifle's bayonet became lodged in a victim, Ishar smoothly transitioned to his kirpan, the traditional Sikh dagger, wielding it with lethal precision. Behind him, the remaining defenders formed a tight defensive circle, each man protecting the other's flanks as they cut their way into the surprised tribal mass. Gul Badshah, the Orakzai leader who had offered terms earlier in the day, described the scene in an account later provided to British authorities. "They came out fighting like demons, not like men. Each one fought as though he had the strength of 10. Our fighters hesitated to approach them, even though we numbered hundreds and they were but a handful. For approximately 4 minutes, an eternity in close-quarter combat, the last defenders of Saragari carved a bloody path through their opponents. Sepoy Gurmukh Singh, the young signaller whose education had been interrupted by his military service, fought with the unexpected ferocity often found in scholarly men pushed to violence. His bayonet and kirpan accounted for 5 confirmed kills before multiple gunshot wounds finally brought him down. Sepoy Bhagwan Singh, the gentle giant whose letters home had described the frontier's beauty, became an instrument of destruction, his massive strength allowing him to literally throw attackers aside as he protected his comrades' flanks. When his bayonet snapped, he used the rifle as a club until it too was wrenched from his grasp, then continued fighting with bare hands until overwhelmed by sheer numbers. One by one, the defenders fell. Tactical cohesion gave way to individual last stands as their formation was gradually pulled apart by the sea of opponents. Yet even in these final moments, their discipline never wavered. Each man died facing his enemy, none attempted to flee, and according to tribal accounts, none asked for quarter. Havildar Ishar Singh was the last to fall. Wounded multiple times, surrounded by the bodies of friend and foe alike, he fought on with mechanical precision until a tribal marksman finally ended his resistance with a shot to the head. Tribal accounts claim that a momentary silence fell over the battlefield at his death, a rare gesture of respect from hardened fighters who recognized extraordinary courage even in an enemy. By 6:30 p.m., the battle for Saragari had ended. All 21 defenders lay dead, having extracted a terrible price for their outpost. Tribal casualties numbered approximately 180 killed and 300-400 wounded, according to subsequent British intelligence estimates. The tribal forces' victory proved Pyrrhic. Their losses and delays allowed the garrisons at Fort Lockhart and Fort Gulistan to strengthen their defenses and ultimately repulse attacks the following day. In an unprecedented break with frontier tradition, the tribal leaders ordered their men not to mutilate the bodies of the fallen Sikhs, a common practice in previous conflicts. Instead, they were laid out according to military rank and their weapons placed beside them, a warrior's tribute from one martial culture to another. Before withdrawing from the captured outpost, Mullah Zayad Akbar himself is reported to have said a brief prayer over the bodies, acknowledging that even enemies can teach us how men should face death. As darkness fell over Saragari on September 12, 1897, British observation posts at Fort Lockhart could see the fires of the captured outpost illuminating the ridge. The following morning, when the first reconnaissance patrols cautiously approached the site, they discovered the full extent of what had transpired, a stand so extraordinary that it would eventually be commemorated in the combat traditions of armies far beyond the British Empire that these 21 men had served. The Battle of Saragarhi had lasted approximately 9 hours from first shot to final casualty. In that brief span, 21 ordinary men had demonstrated extraordinary courage, transforming a minor outpost into hallowed ground and writing their names into military history with their blood. Their actions that day would eventually earn each man a posthumous Indian Order of Merit, the highest award available to Indian troops at that time, parliamentary recognition in London, memorial gurdwaras across India, and a place in military education curriculums around the world as the epitome of discipline and courage against overwhelming odds. At the precise moment that Havildar Ishar Singh and his men were making their final charge at Saragarhi, Colonel John Horton stood on the observation platform of Fort Lockhart, field glasses trained on the distant outpost. The 7 miles separating the positions seemed to compress as he witnessed the barracks building erupting in flames and smoke. Though he could not discern individual figures at this distance, the cessation of rifle fire told its own story. "They're gone," he said quietly to the officers beside him. A career soldier with decades of frontier experience, Horton was not given to emotional displays. Yet those present would later report that he removed his helmet as the firing stopped, a spontaneous gesture of respect that his subordinates immediately mirrored. The strategic implications of Saragari's fall were immediately apparent. With the communication link severed, Forts Lockhart and Gulistan would now have to operate as isolated positions, unable to coordinate their defenses against the tribal force that would surely turn its attention to them next. Yet the 21 Sikhs had accomplished something remarkable. They had fixed in place a significant portion of the tribal army for an entire day, allowing both major forts to complete defensive preparations that would have been impossible had they been simultaneously assaulted. Lieutenant Colonel Roland Cadell, commanding at Fort Gulistan, received the news of Saragari's fall via a pre-arranged signal. 3 rifle shots fired in quick succession from Fort Lockhart's western bastion, visible across the valley despite the gathering dusk. His response was immediate and practical. Additional sangars, stone breastworks, were constructed at vulnerable points. Water supplies were secured against potential contamination, and ammunition was distributed to defensive positions with specific firing orders to conserve rounds. Throughout the night of September 12-13, the men of both forts maintained vigilant watch, expecting the tribal force to capitalize on their victory. The darkness carried distant sounds of celebration from the tribal encampments, ritual drumming, occasional gunfire, and the wailing songs that marked both victory and mourning in Pashtun tradition. British officers, familiar with frontier warfare, recognized these as preparations for renewed conflict rather than signs of the enemy's satisfaction. Dawn on September the 13th revealed the tactical evolution of the tribal force. Having learned costly lessons at Saragari about frontal assaults against prepared positions, they had divided into smaller, more mobile groups that established firing positions at the extreme range of their weapons. Their strategy now appeared focused on Fort Gulistan, presumably judged more vulnerable due to its smaller garrison and more exposed position. By mid-morning, Lieutenant Colonel Cadell faced a situation eerily reminiscent of Saragari's opening phase. Tribal marksmen had established a loose cordon around Fort Gulistan, maintaining harassing fire while larger groups prepared the same mobile shields and scaling equipment that had proven effective the previous day. Unlike Saragari, however, Gulistan possessed artillery, 2 mountain guns capable of firing explosive shells that could devastate concentrations of attackers. Cadell ordered these guns into action at 10:30 a.m., targeting the largest visible groups of tribal fighters. The psychological impact of artillery far exceeded its physical effects. The shell's shrieking flight and explosive detonation triggered momentary panic among tribesmen accustomed to rifle fire, but not to these mechanized weapons of industrial warfare. This advantage proved temporary as the tribal leaders rapidly adapted, dispersing their forces into smaller groups that presented less viable targets for the limited ammunition of the mountain guns. By noon, the situation at Fort Gulistan had become critical. Tribal fighters had established positions within 300 yards of the walls and were advancing in short rushes behind natural cover and improvised shields. The fort's design provided better fields of fire than Saragari had offered, but the sheer number of attackers, estimated at $8,000, threatened to overwhelm the defenses through simultaneous assaults on multiple sections. The critical moment came at approximately 1:15 p.m. when a determined tribal charge reached the northwestern corner of Gulistan's perimeter. Scouts had identified this as the fort's most vulnerable point, where the terrain offered cover for approaching attackers and the defensive wall stood slightly lower than elsewhere. Using the same tactics that had succeeded at Saragari, tribal fighters established a breaching team under the protection of large shields, attempting to dismantle the foundation stones. The fort's garrison responded with a tactic that had not been available to the men of Saragari. Private bandsman Charles Harvey and 3 other soldiers volunteered for what amounted to a suicide mission, a counter-sortie beyond the walls to disrupt the breaching operation. Armed with long-handled demolition charges typically used for engineering purposes, these 4 men slipped out through a small sally port and worked their way along the wall's exterior to a position directly above the tribal breaching team. Harvey's subsequent action earned him the Indian Order of Merit, the highest award then available to British enlisted men serving in Indian regiments. Dropping down virtually into the midst of the breaching team, he and his companions placed their charges directly against the tribal shields, the resulting explosions killing or wounding most of the team and creating momentary confusion that allowed 3 of the 4 soldiers to regain the safety of the fort. Harvey himself, wounded in the leg, was the last to return, practically dragged through the sally port by his comrades as tribal fighters recovered from their surprise. This bold counterattack temporarily relieved pressure on the fort's perimeter, but by mid-afternoon, the tribal force had renewed their efforts with even greater determination. Multiple breaching teams now worked simultaneously against different sections of the wall, while covering fire from tribal marksmen targeted any defender who showed himself above the parapets. At Fort Lockhart, Colonel Horton monitored this deteriorating situation with growing concern, but limited options. The 5-mile path between the forts crossed exposed terrain that would render any relief force vulnerable to ambush from the thousands of tribal fighters occupying the intervening ridges. Yet doing nothing meant potentially losing Fort Gulistan and its garrison, an outcome that would render the sacrifice at Saragari meaningless. At 3:30 p.m., Horton made the kind of decision that defines leadership in crisis. He would personally lead a small, highly mobile relief force to Fort Gulistan, not to reinforce the garrison, which would be impossible with the numbers available, but to coordinate a synchronized defense between the 2 positions. The risks were enormous. The small column would be moving through territory dominated by enemy forces many times their number. Captain Alistair Denys recalled this moment in his subsequent report. Colonel Horton called for volunteers, though he needn't have bothered. Every able man stepped forward. He selected 22 of us, all mounted, with instructions to travel light, ammunition, water, and nothing else. His final order before we departed remains with me. We ride to support our comrades or die in the attempt. There is no middle course. The relief column departed Fort Lockhart at 4 p.m., taking an unexpected route that initially led away from Fort Gulistan before cutting back through a deep ravine that tribal forces had left relatively unguarded, considering it too difficult for rapid movement. This circuitous approach, combined with the gathering dusk, allowed Horton's small force to avoid direct confrontation with the main tribal army. By 5:40 p.m., as twilight deepened into night, the relief column had reached the eastern approach to Fort Gulistan. Their final dash to the fort's gates came under sporadic fire, but suffered no casualties, the combination of poor light, unexpected direction, and speed having caught tribal pickets by surprise. Horton's arrival transformed the defense of Fort Gulistan. Though he brought few additional men, his tactical coordination allowed the fort's garrison to concentrate their limited resources at the most threatened points, rather than maintaining an evenly distributed defense. More importantly, he carried detailed information about the relief column approaching from the south, a regular British brigade that had force-marched for 2 days after receiving news of the tribal uprising. Throughout the night of September 13-14, Fort Gulistan endured constant harassment from tribal forces, including several determined scaling attempts that were repulsed with bayonet and rifle. As dawn approached, Cadell and Horton observed a significant change in tribal activity. Many fighters appeared to be withdrawing southward, apparently having received intelligence about the approaching relief column. By noon on September 14th, the tribal force had largely melted away into the surrounding mountains, their united front fragmenting as different clans made independent decisions about continuing the conflict. Some leaders advocated consolidating their gains and negotiating from a position of strength. Others argued for immediate withdrawal to prepare for the larger British response that would inevitably follow. At 3:15 p.m. on September 14th, the advance elements of Brigadier General Yeatman Biggs's relief column came into view from Fort Gulistan's observation platform. The tribal uprising that had threatened to overwhelm the frontier outposts had been contained, not defeated but certainly blunted in its initial force. The cost had been severe. Beyond the 21 Sikhs at Saragari, the two major forts had suffered 12 killed and 28 wounded, a significant toll for their small garrisons. Yet against this must be measured what they had accomplished, holding their positions against an enemy that outnumbered them perhaps 50-1, preserving British control of the strategic Samana Ridge, and demonstrating that tribal numerical superiority would not automatically translate to victory against disciplined professional troops. As the relief column's forward elements reached Fort Gulistan, Brigadier Yeatman Biggs' first request was to be shown the observed location of Saragari. Standing beside Horton on the observation platform, field glasses trained on the now silent outpost, the brigadier asked the question that would echo through subsequent military and political discussions. How did 21 men hold against thousands for an entire day? The answer would be sought not just in tactical analysis, but in the deeper cultural and psychological elements that had produced such extraordinary resistance. Saragari had demonstrated something beyond military training or colonial loyalty, something rooted in the Sikh martial tradition that would soon capture the imagination of the entire British Empire and beyond. News of the Saragari engagement and the successful defense of Forts Lockhart and Gulistan reached the highest echelons of the British military and political establishment with remarkable speed. The telegraph network that connected frontier outposts to provincial headquarters in Peshawar, and from there to the vice-regal offices in Simla, and ultimately to London, carried Brigadier Yeatman Biggs's initial report within hours of his arrival at Fort Gulistan. While military commanders analyzed the tactical significance, politicians recognized the broader implications for an empire increasingly concerned about Russian influence along its northwestern frontier. Lord Elgin, the Viceroy of India, personally drafted a communiqué to London that framed the defense of Saragari as evidence of both the loyalty of Sikh troops and the strategic importance of holding the frontier against tribal insurgency, potentially backed by foreign interests. In London, the initial report was delivered to Queen Victoria during her breakfast on September 18th. The monarch, whose personal interest in Indian affairs had intensified since assuming the title of Empress of India in 1877, reportedly set aside her meal to read the dispatch in its entirety. Her reaction, recorded by her private secretary, Sir Arthur Bigg, would shape the official response. These brave soldiers died at their post doing their duty. Their heroism should receive the recognition it deserves. The Queen's directive set in motion an unprecedented response. Never before had posthumous awards of the Indian Order of Merit been granted to an entire unit. The traditional requirement for eyewitness accounts of individual acts of valor presented an obvious problem. No survivors remained to attest to specific actions. This bureaucratic obstacle was swept aside by direct royal intervention, with the Queen herself declaring that the collective stand was itself sufficient evidence of each man's valor. Meanwhile, Brigadier Yeatman Biggs' relief force had undertaken the grim duty of recovering the bodies from Saragari. What they found exceeded even the hardened soldiers' expectations. Captain George Paley, who led the recovery detail, wrote in his report, "The scene at Saragari defies adequate description. The defenders appear to have exacted an extraordinary toll before being overcome. Tribal bodies lie in concentric rings around positions where individual Sikhs made their stands, with the densest concentration surrounding what appears to have been Havildar Ishar Singh's final position. The British recovery team was struck by the fact that the bodies of the Saragari defenders had not been mutilated, a significant departure from tribal custom in frontier warfare. This unusual respect from their adversaries was explained when British intelligence officers later interviewed tribal participants through local intermediaries. One Afridi sub-commander reportedly stated, "We do not desecrate the bodies of men who die so bravely. They earned the right to remain whole in death." Forensic examination of the battlefield revealed details that would later be incorporated into military training manuals. The defenders had maintained remarkable fire discipline until the final moments. Spent cartridge cases were found in orderly piles rather than scattered randomly, indicating controlled volleys rather than panicked suppressive fire. Blood patterns and body positions suggested that even when the perimeter was breached, the Sikhs had fallen back in orderly tactical withdrawals rather than individual retreats. Most telling was the ammunition count. Of the 400 rounds per man that constituted standard issue, an average of 382 empty cartridges were recovered per defender. In the words of the examining officer, they held their fire until assured of effect and maintained discipline until virtually the last cartridge. The bodies of the 21 were transported to Camp Lockhart, where military funeral rites were conducted with full honors on September 17th. Colonel Horton, still bearing the emotional weight of having ordered the men to hold their position against impossible odds, delivered a eulogy that was later reproduced in regimental histories. These men did not simply die in service to the Empire. They died upholding the highest traditions of their faith and the sacred trust placed in them as soldiers. No commander could ask more of his men, and no men could give more than they gave. In accordance with Sikh tradition, the bodies were cremated on funeral pyres, their ashes later collected for return to their homes in Punjab. Each man's personal effects were meticulously catalogued and prepared for delivery to their families, along with their posthumous medals and the official letters of condolence that would soon bear the Empress's signature. The political aftershocks of Saragari extended far beyond military circles. In an era when colonial subjects' loyalty was constantly scrutinized and sometimes questioned, the stand of the 21 Sikhs became a powerful counter-narrative to independence sentiments. Colonial administrators across India highlighted the battle in publications and public addresses, emphasizing the mutual respect and shared valor that supposedly united the diverse elements of the empire. This political utilization, however, could not diminish the genuine impact of the story as it spread through India, particularly in Punjab. When news reached the villages from which the 21 had come, the response defied colonial expectations. Rather than displays of grief alone, communities organized celebratory processions that honored the fallen as shaheeds, martyrs, a status of profound religious significance in Sikh tradition. In Bathinda, the home district of Havildar Ishar Singh, local records describe a gathering of over 5,000 people to honor his memory. Speakers recounted his life story, emphasizing not his service to British interests, but his embodiment of Khalsa principles, the warrior traditions established by Guru Gobind Singh that emphasize standing against overwhelming odds in defense of righteous causes. Similar ceremonies took place across Punjab, transforming the men of Saragari from colonial soldiers to cultural icons virtually overnight. Folk ballads, vars, composed in their honor, spread through oral tradition, emphasizing their choice to die fighting rather than surrender. These artistic interpretations often explicitly connected the stand at Saragari to earlier episodes in Sikh history, particularly the martyrdom of Guru Tegh Bahadur and the last stand of Baba Deep Singh. This cultural reclamation presented colonial authorities with a complex challenge. While they welcomed the celebration of martial valor that reinforced the image of Sikhs as a martial race, suitable for military service, they were less comfortable with interpretations that emphasized religious duty over colonial loyalty as the primary motivation. Official British accounts increasingly emphasized the professional aspects of the defense: tactical acumen, fire discipline, and military cohesion, while downplaying the religious and cultural elements that resonated more deeply in Punjab. Colonial discomfort notwithstanding, the story of Saragari rapidly transcended cultural boundaries. Within weeks, detailed accounts had appeared in major newspapers across the empire and beyond. The Times of London devoted its front page to the battle on September 25th, while the New York Times carried a substantial article on October 3rd under the headline, "21 against 10,000, How Sikh Soldiers Died at Their Posts in India." Military professionals worldwide took particular interest in the tactical aspects of the engagement: the effective use of a minimally defensible position, the importance of communications in coordinating wider operations, and the psychological impact of determined resistance against overwhelming odds, all offered lessons applicable beyond the specific context of frontier warfare. French military observer Captain Henri Lavis, who had been attached to British forces in India and was granted access to the official reports, wrote an analysis for his superiors that concluded, "The lesson of Saragari is not merely one of courage, though that was present in abundance. It demonstrates that properly trained and motivated infantry, even in small numbers, can impose disproportionate costs on numerically superior forces through disciplined fire and proper use of terrain." For the 36th Sikhs, the impact was immediate and profound. The regiment's distinctive battle cry became Saragari, and September 12th was established as a permanent day of remembrance in the regimental calendar. Colonel Horton, understanding the cultural significance beyond military honors, commissioned the construction of a memorial Gurdwara, Sikh temple, near the regimental headquarters, funded through voluntary contributions from officers of both British and Indian ancestry. The more lasting impact would unfold gradually as the story of Saragari became incorporated into educational materials throughout India and the wider empire. School textbooks presented the battle as an example of courage transcending cultural differences, while military academies incorporated tactical analyses into their curricula. Through these institutional channels, the 21 defenders achieved a form of immortality that transcended both their individual identities and the colonial context in which they had served. Perhaps the most significant legacy emerged in Punjab itself, where Saragari fundamentally reshaped the relationship between Sikh communities and military service. Enlistment rates in Sikh-designated regiments increased dramatically in the months following the battle, with many recruits explicitly citing the example of the 21 as their inspiration. For a colonial power always concerned about maintaining adequate military manpower, this surge in volunteering represented a tangible benefit beyond symbolic value. The transformation of Saragari from obscure outpost to legendary battlefield was complete within a year of the engagement. When the anniversary was marked on September 12, 1898, commemorations occurred not only at military installations throughout India, but in London, where the newly established Sikh temple held a special service attended by representatives of the royal household. Though the northwest frontier would see many more conflicts in the coming decades, none would capture public imagination or military attention as completely as the stand of the 21. In sacrificing their lives, the men of Saragari had achieved something rare in military history: universal respect that transcended the political causes for which they fought, and recognition that came not just from their comrades or commanders, but from their adversaries and the wider world. 3 days after the battle, as British forces secured the Samana Ridge and began reconstruction of Saragari outpost, a remarkable discovery was made among the ruins. Lieutenant William Holt, supervising the clearing operation, noticed an unusual metal container partially buried beneath collapsed stonework near what had been the signaling tower. The small brass case, standard issue for protecting important documents from weather and battlefield conditions, had somehow survived the destruction, relatively intact. Inside, Holt found several sheets of paper covered with handwriting in Gurmukhi script. Though he couldn't read the contents, he immediately recognized their potential significance and delivered the case directly to Colonel Horton. The colonel, having spent decades in Punjab, had sufficient grasp of the language to realize he held something extraordinary. The personal journals of Sepoy Gurmukh Singh, the young signaller who had maintained communications until the final moments of the battle. The boy kept writing, even as they were being overrun, Horton remarked with visible emotion as he translated the final entries. The last words were penned perhaps minutes before his death. The journal provided an unprecedented window into the psychological state of the defenders during their final hours, not through the romanticized lens of colonial reports or the tactical analysis of military observers, but in the authentic voice of a young soldier confronting his own mortality with remarkable clarity. The entry from the morning of September the 12th revealed the atmosphere before the fighting began. Dawn today with strange feeling. The others joke as usual, but voices too loud, laughter too quick. Havildar Ji called us together before light. No formal speech, only reminder of our oath to regiment and faith. Bhagwan Singh spoke of his children and showed their carved wooden toys he carries. We all shared jaggery from Jiwan Singh's secret store. Strange how sweet it tasted today. As the battle progressed, Gurmukh's entries became more sporadic, brief observations recorded during momentary lulls in his signaling duties. Noon now. Cannot count the enemy any longer. They flow like water around rocks. Havildar Ji moves constantly, encouraging, directing fire. No fear in his voice, though he must know what comes. Third attack repulsed, but they learn our methods quickly. Their leader must be experienced soldier. Each wave comes differently, testing new approaches. Our ammunition will not last against such numbers. Most poignant were the entries after the breaching of the walls, as the situation deteriorated. North wall down. Fighting inside compound now. Lal Singh fell protecting the breach, 7 by his rifle before they reached him. Water gone. Ammunition low. Heliograph still functions. Our link to Lockhart remains while I live. The final entry, written in a noticeably unsteady hand, provided insight into the defenders' state of mind in their last moments. Permission granted to join final defense. Strange peace now. The Guru's words come clearly. Grant me this boon, O God, from thy greatness. May I never refrain from righteous acts. We die today, but the regiment lives. Perhaps someday someone will remember what happened at Saragari. Colonel Horton ensured these final thoughts reached an audience far beyond anything Gurmukh Singh could have imagined. Copies of the journal, with careful translations, were forwarded to military headquarters, the Viceroy's office, and ultimately to London. Queen Victoria reportedly requested her own copy after hearing excerpts, ensuring that the young signaler's words would be preserved in the royal archives. Beyond official channels, the journal transformed public perception of the engagement. Previously, reports had emphasized tactical aspects and the strategic significance of delaying the tribal force. Now, The human dimension emerged in the authentic voice of a participant. Newspapers throughout the empire published translated excerpts, highlighting the calm courage and sense of duty evident in Gurmukh's matter-of-fact descriptions. The discovery of the journal coincided with another remarkable development: the emergence of tribal accounts of the battle. British intelligence officers, working through frontier intermediaries, made contact with several participants willing to share their perspective. Their testimony, while filtered through translation and political considerations, provided unprecedented insight into how the defenders had appeared to their adversaries. Malik Abdur Rahman, who had led one of the assault groups against Saragari's north wall, offered particular insight into the battle's final phase. "We believed victory assured once the wall fell, but these men fought more fiercely inside their compound than behind their walls. The one they called Ishar Singh, we learned his name later, organized them even in retreat, always keeping formation, always protecting each other. We would kill one only to find another in his place, firing with deliberate aim rather than panic. At the end, when they came out from the burning building, our fighters hesitated, despite having them outnumbered hundreds to one. There was something in their eyes, not fear, not even anger, but a terrible resolve. They fought like men who had already accepted death and were concerned only with the price they could exact before it claimed them." These accounts, combined with Gurmukh Singh's journal, created a multi-layered understanding of Saragari that transcended simple military heroism or colonial propaganda. What emerged was a human story of extraordinary choices made by ordinary men, choices rooted in complex notions of duty, faith, brotherhood, and personal honor. The final communications between Saragari and Fort Lockhart, historically significant but clinically recorded in military logs, took on new emotional resonance when contextualized by Gurmukh's private reflections. His terse official message requesting permission to join the final defense, when paired with his journal entry about experiencing strange peace, revealed the human being behind the professional facade. Colonel Horton, still processing his own role in the events, took an unprecedented step in response to these discoveries. Breaking with the formal language typical of military reports, he submitted a personal addendum to his official account, addressed directly to the Commander-in-Chief of British forces in India. Beyond the tactical analysis already submitted, I feel compelled to address the human aspect of what transpired at Saragari. The decision to maintain this outpost with minimal garrison was mine, as was the order to hold position when attack came. These decisions were militarily sound, but sent 21 men to certain death. Having now read the private thoughts of the youngest among them, I find myself humbled by their acceptance of this duty. Sepoy Gurmukh Singh, barely 21 years of age, maintained communications until the final moments, then requested permission to join a fight he knew could end only in his death. His journal reveals he did so, not from fatalism, but from a profound sense of brotherhood with his comrades and dedication to something larger than himself. I submit that we who command from positions of relative safety must strive to be worthy of such men, regardless of the racial or religious differences that supposedly separate us. The loyalty they demonstrated was not blind colonial subservience, but adherence to personal and collective codes of honor that deserve our profound respect. This document circulated through the highest echelons of the British military establishment, challenging prevailing colonial attitudes about native troops and influencing subsequent policy. General Sir William Lockhart, Commander-in-Chief in India, after whom Fort Lockhart had been named, issued a directive that Sikh religious practices be accommodated within military regulations whenever possible, a significant departure from previous standardization efforts. For the families of the 21, these revelations provided a more personal form of solace than official honors or government pensions. When translated copies of Gurmukh Singh's journal reached Punjab, they were treated as sacred texts in the homes of the fallen. Public readings were organized in villages, where the defenders' final thoughts reinforced communal pride rather than grief. Ishar Singh's widow, upon receiving the translated account of her husband's leadership during the final hours, reportedly responded with remarkable composure. "He died as he lived, thinking of his duty and his men before himself. I expected nothing less." This stoicism, rooted in Sikh philosophical traditions regarding death and duty, confounded British officials expecting more demonstrative mourning. The final communications from Saragari, both the official heliograph messages and Gurmukh Singh's private journal, transformed what might have been a footnote in frontier military history into something approaching legend. By giving voice to the defenders' thoughts, motivations, and spiritual preparation for death, these documents humanized what could otherwise have been abstracted into mere statistics of colonial warfare. Perhaps most significantly, they revealed the complexity behind seemingly simple concepts like duty and loyalty in colonial contexts. The defenders of Saragari had not died for abstract imperial interests or distant monarchs, but for immediate bonds of brotherhood, personal honor, religious principles, and professional identity that transcended colonial relationships. As reconstruction of the outpost progressed, Colonel Horton made another unprecedented decision. Rather than simply restoring Saragari to its original functional design, he ordered the incorporation of commemorative elements, stone tablets bearing the names of the 21, positioned so that all who served there subsequently would pass them daily. This transformation of a utilitarian military position into a site of memory ensured that the story would be physically inscribed into the landscape of the frontier. The final message from Saragari, Gurmukh Singh's request to join the defense, became a training example in Sikh regiments throughout the British Indian Army. Young signallers were taught that their primary duty was maintaining communications until the last possible moment, but that they remained soldiers first, with all the obligations that entailed. The phrase, "request permission to close and join battle," entered military vocabulary as shorthand for extraordinary commitment to duty. When the reconstructed heliograph at Saragari transmitted its first message to Fort Lockhart on January 15, 1898, the operator followed a new protocol established by Colonel Horton. Before any operational communications, he sent 21 dots of light, one for each of the fallen, as a daily remembrance. This practice continued until the outpost was finally decommissioned decades later, ensuring that the final messages from Saragari were never truly the last. News of Saragari reached London as Britain's autumn chill descended upon the capital. The initial telegraphic dispatches, published in the Times on September 18, 1897, occupied a modest space on page 4. One colonial skirmish among many in an empire that spanned a quarter of the globe. Within 2 weeks, however, the story had migrated to front-page prominence, capturing public imagination in a way that surprised even veteran political observers. The transformation began in an unlikely venue, the House of Commons, where Parliamentary Under-Secretary for India, George Nathaniel Curzon, departed from bureaucratic caution to deliver what many considered the most passionate speech of his career. Standing before a hushed chamber on October 8th, Curzon eschewed the dry statistical approach typical of colonial reports. The House is perhaps weary of accounts from distant outposts, where maps must be consulted to locate the geography in question. He began with characteristic formality before his tone shifted dramatically. Yet I submit that certain actions transcend their location and speak to qualities we, as Britons, profess to value above all others. At Saragari, 21 soldiers of the 36th Sikh Regiment, under the command of Havildar Ishar Singh, demonstrated such extraordinary valor that I would be remiss in my duties if I did not bring their actions to this chamber's attention in detail. For nearly 40 minutes, Curzon held the chamber's rapt attention with a narrative that emphasized both tactical brilliance and human courage. His uncharacteristic emotional delivery culminated in a declaration that would be reproduced in newspapers throughout the empire. In the annals of military history, I doubt whether any episode quite so magnificent has ever been recorded. This parliamentary recognition catapulted Saragari from regional news to imperial sensation. The following morning, the Times devoted its entire front page to the battle, including architectural diagrams of the outpost, maps of the frontier region, and the first published photographs of several of the defenders, obtained from regimental records. The timing proved fortuitous for British imperial messaging. The late 1890s had brought increasing questions about colonial practices and growing nationalist sentiments in various territories. Saragari offered a counter-narrative that emphasized mutual respect and shared valor across racial and religious boundaries, a perfect illustration of the imperial ideal rather than the often exploitative reality. Queen Victoria's personal interest further elevated the story's prominence. Breaking with protocol, she summoned to Windsor Castle not only senior military officials, but representatives of London's small Sikh community. During this unprecedented audience on October 15th, she reportedly stated that the story of these brave men should be taught to all our children, British and Indian alike. The Queen's specific directive regarding the posthumous awards highlighted the unique nature of the recognition. Typically, the Indian Order of Merit required witness statements attesting to specific acts of valor, an impossibility when no defenders survived. Victoria's instruction that the defense itself shall serve as sufficient evidence of each man's valor bypassed bureaucratic obstacles and established a precedent for unit citations that would influence military recognition practices for decades. The actual medals, the Indian equivalent of the Victoria Cross, were crafted with particular attention to detail. Each bore the name of its recipient in both English and Gurmukhi script, an uncommon accommodation of cultural identity. The Queen personally insisted that the families receive not just the medals, but detailed accounts of how their men had died, translated into their native language. These medals began their journey to Punjab in November 1897, transported with ceremonial dignity that underscored their importance. Rather than being shipped as administrative items, they traveled with a dedicated honor guard, stopping at major military installations en route for formal recognition ceremonies. By the time they reached Peshawar, gateway to the northwest frontier, the medals had become objects of reverence among both British and Indian troops. The presentation ceremonies in Punjab transformed from standard military functions into cultural events of unprecedented scale. In Amritsar, close to the homes of several defenders, over 20,000 people gathered to honor the families as they received the medals. The ceremony combined military precision with Sikh religious elements, establishing a template for cross-cultural commemoration that acknowledged both imperial service and religious identity. For the families themselves, these public ceremonies brought practical benefits beyond symbolic recognition. The standard pension for families of fallen soldiers was supplemented by special grants authorized directly by the Viceroy. Additionally, land allocations, particularly valuable in agricultural Punjab, were provided to each family, ensuring financial security beyond immediate compensation. More significant than these material considerations was the elevation of the family's social status. In Punjab's village communities, they became known as Saragari families, a designation that carried immense respect and often exempted them from certain communal obligations. Children and grandchildren of the 21 would carry this distinction for generations, with educational and employment opportunities enhanced by their connection to the battle. Meanwhile, the martial reputation of Sikhs, already substantial, reached new heights throughout the empire. Colonial recruiters reported unprecedented interest in military service from Sikh communities, with many potential recruits explicitly citing Saragari as their inspiration. The 36th Sikh Regiment, in particular, found itself overwhelmed with applicants eager to join the unit that had produced such renowned warriors. This surge in recruitment proved fortuitous for imperial administrators increasingly concerned about Russian activities along the northern frontiers. The Great Game, the strategic competition between British and Russian interests in Central Asia, had entered a new phase of intensity by the late 1890s. Securing the loyalty of martial communities like the Sikhs represented a crucial advantage in this geopolitical chess match. Beyond the political and military spheres, Saragari penetrated British popular culture in ways few colonial stories had managed. By early 1898, the battle had inspired poems, songs, theatrical productions, and even early cinematic representations. The illustrated weekly magazines, Victorian equivalents of modern mass media, featured dramatic renditions of the last stand, often with romanticized imagery, but maintaining the essential narrative of extraordinary courage against overwhelming odds. In Punjab, cultural commemoration took different forms, more deeply rooted in Sikh traditions. Oral ballads, vars, composed by traditional bards, spread the story through rural communities, often explicitly connecting Saragari to earlier episodes of Sikh military valor, dating back to the founding gurus. These compositions emphasized religious duty and sacrifice over colonial service, subtly reclaiming the narrative from imperial framing. Religious institutions played a central role in this cultural preservation. The first memorial Gurdwara, dedicated to Saragari, was established in Amritsar in early 1898, funded primarily through community donations rather than colonial grants. This sacred space explicitly connected the defenders to the broader pantheon of Sikh martyrs, contextualizing their sacrifice within religious rather than imperial history. Perhaps the most significant commemorative action came from an unexpected quarter. The tribal leaders who had led the attack on Saragari, while continuing to resist British encroachment in their territories, nonetheless acknowledged the exceptional nature of the defense they had encountered. Through intermediaries, they communicated a desire to mark the battle site with their own memorial stone, a gesture unprecedented in frontier warfare. After complex negotiations involving military officials, diplomatic services, and religious authorities from both sides, this extraordinary arrangement was approved. In August 1898, nearly a year after the battle, a delegation of the tribal elders approached Saragarhi under flag of truce to place a simple stone marker inscribed in Pashto. Here fought men whose courage will be told around fires as long as there are warriors to listen. This gesture of respect from adversaries solidified Saragari's transcendent status, a battle that had risen above its political context to become a universal exemplar of martial virtue. The image of former enemies performing this act of recognition featured prominently in imperial publications as evidence of the supposed civilizing influence of British military traditions, though tribal accounts emphasized their recognition of warrior kinship that predated and would outlast colonial structures. The first anniversary observations in September 1898 formalized Saragari's entry into official military tradition. The 36th Sikh Regiment received permission to add Saragari to their battle colors, a distinction typically reserved for engagements involving substantially larger forces. More significantly, September 12th was designated a regimental holiday, with all routine duties suspended for memorial observances. Colonial education systems further cemented the battle's legendary status. By 1899, the story had been incorporated into standard curricula throughout British India, though with significant variations in emphasis. In schools serving primarily British children, the narrative highlighted imperial unity and the loyalty of colonial subjects. In Punjab schools, the focus shifted towards Sikh martial traditions and religious duty, with colonial context minimized. Military academies worldwide incorporated tactical analyses of Saragari into their curricula, focusing on the asymmetric defense aspects that would become increasingly relevant in modern warfare. The battle became a standard case study at Sandhurst, Britain's premier officer training institution, where cadets analyzed how disciplined infantry could effectively counter superior numbers through fire control, terrain usage, and psychological factors. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, Saragari's immediate political utility faded, but its symbolic power endured. The defenders became archetypal figures representing values that transcended their specific historical context: courage, discipline, sacrifice, loyalty to comrades, and adherence to principle regardless of consequences. When Field Marshal Frederick Roberts, former commander-in-chief in India and one of Britain's most respected military figures, addressed new officer cadets at Sandhurst in 1902, he chose Saragari as his central example of leadership under extreme conditions. Study not just how they fought, but why they fought. 21 men chose certain death, rather than abandonment of duty. Such commitment cannot be created through regulations or discipline alone. It emerges from deeper wellsprings of identity and belonging that the finest officers learn to recognize and honor in those they command. Perhaps the most telling indicator of Saragari's transformation from historical event to cultural touchstone came in 1905, when acclaimed war correspondent Winston Churchill, having recently reported from colonial conflicts in Sudan and South Africa, visited Punjab to research a potential book on frontier warfare. When asked by a local journalist to name the most impressive military action he had encountered in his extensive coverage of imperial conflicts, Churchill replied without hesitation, "Saragari, nothing compares to it." The 21 defenders had accomplished something rare in military history: universal respect that transcended the politics of their time. Their story had moved beyond factual accounts into the realm of legend, not through exaggeration or myth-making, but through the authentic recognition that some actions reveal the highest possibilities of human courage and commitment. As the reconstructed outpost at Saragari continued its vigilant watch over the frontier, the simple stone monument at its center, bearing 21 names, ensured that visitors would remember not just a military engagement, but a moment when ordinary men made extraordinary choices that would echo through generations to come. The story of Saragari might have faded into historical obscurity, like countless other colonial engagements, were it not for a chance discovery in 1921. Lieutenant James Allen, a young officer serving with the reorganized Sikh Pioneers Regiment, was cataloguing artifacts at the Regimental Museum in Peshawar when he encountered a dusty wooden box marked simply Saragari, Personal Effects. Inside lay items recovered from the battle site during reconstruction: bent bayonets, charred uniform fragments, melted rifle parts, the physical remnants of extraordinary sacrifice. Beneath these relics, Allen found a small leather pouch containing a tarnished identification tag bearing the name Sepoy Gurmukh Singh. Attached was a handwritten note from the recovery team. Found approximately 200 yards northeast of outpost perimeter. Significance unknown. This discovery sparked a mystery that would captivate military historians for decades. How had the young signaler's identification tag ended up so far from the outpost where all defenders were confirmed killed? More puzzling still, why was it the only item found beyond the immediate battle site? Allen's subsequent investigation uncovered tribal accounts never previously translated that suggested something extraordinary. During the final phase of the battle, one defender, described as young and swift, had attempted a desperate breakout toward Fort Lockhart, presumably to deliver a final message. According to these accounts, the warrior had fought through multiple tribal positions before finally being overwhelmed nearly a quarter-mile from the outpost. Could Sepoy Gurmukh Singh, the last man in communication with Fort Lockhart, have attempted such a mission? The physical evidence suggested this possibility, though no definitive proof could be established. What message could have been so crucial that a soldier would attempt such an impossible journey? The question found no conclusive answer, but it added a final layer of poignancy to an already remarkable story. Perhaps, in those desperate closing moments, one of the 21 had fought not just to sell his life dearly, but in the faint hope of breaking through with vital intelligence for the larger garrisons. In Punjab villages today, this possibility has transformed into certainty through oral tradition. Folk singers tell of the young signaller who carried his comrades' final words beyond the battle, ensuring their sacrifice would never be forgotten. Whether historically accurate or not, this belief captures a deeper truth. The 21 men of Saragari continue to speak across time, their example illuminating the heights of human courage and commitment. Their memorial at the reconstructed Saragari Gurudwara bears an inscription that serves as their enduring message. The 21 fought like one, and the one fought like 21. In military academies worldwide, their stand remains a case study in how determination can transcend mathematical odds. In their homeland, they are remembered not as colonial subjects, but as embodiments of Sikh martial tradition at its finest. Perhaps most remarkably, their story resonates equally with their former adversaries. In tribal areas of what is now Pakistan, elders still recount the battle with a respect that transcends former enmities. "We fought many foreigners," one Pashtun oral history relates, "but only at Saragari did we face men who made us question whether victory was worth its price." The 21 defenders of Saragari left no survivors to tell their tale, yet their story endures with unusual clarity and power. Through official records, personal artifacts, enemy accounts, and cultural commemoration, they achieved a form of immortality reserved for those whose actions speak to something universal in the human experience: the capacity for ordinary individuals, when bound by shared purpose and principle, to accomplish the extraordinary. In this sense, there is indeed a 21st man of Saragari, not a physical survivor, but the living legacy that continues to inspire new generations across cultural and national boundaries. As long as courage, loyalty, and sacrifice remain human virtues, the signal fire lit by 21 Sikh soldiers on a forgotten frontier outpost will never truly be extinguished.